Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the BRLSI. My name is Charles Draper. I'm the chairman of the Herschel Society, and great welcome to this conference, which we hope will be a splendid affair celebrating astronomy of William Herschel. Some admin announcements first. If you need to use the toilets, the ladies one floor down and gentlemen on the ground floor. There's no expected fire alarm practice here, but if fire alarm does go off, it's for real. Therefore, you either leave the building the way you came in, or through the door at the back and down the stairs there. And when you're on the street, turn right, go around the corner, and there's a small patch of grass, which gets very crowded, but there you go. So that's it in terms of the admin stuff. Why are we here today? William Herschel died in 1822. This is the 200th anniversary of his death, and we decided some time ago to celebrate his achievements in a whole variety of ways. This is culminating in this weekend. So last night, as many of you know, we had a concert of his music in St. Stephen's Church here, which was a splendid sense of pure range of his creativity in his musical life. And today we're celebrating his astronomy. He's one of these really amazing people who was pretty good at two things, and his life had these two halves. So what we'll do today in terms of the programme you have in front of you, and I hope it sort of makes sense, but it's mainly a series of talks followed by Q&A sessions. So after I shut up, we'll have Mike Edmunds giving an introduction. And this is a deliberately an introduction with no Q&A. So it's just set the scene. Many of you know the scene anyway, but no harm in that. And then we'll have Jim Bennett remotely talking about William's telescopes, and then Volkan, and a coffee break. And the coffee break will be in the room behind you, self-service. Then Wolfgang Steinecker will tell us about William's observing techniques and so on. And then Sean Foster will tell us about some of the wonderful things that the RS Library has of William and Caroline. Then we have a lunch break. For most of you, that's go and find some lunch, I'm afraid. We are providing some lunches to speakers, but if you're getting a free lunch, you know about it. So. But we will also at the same time have two sort of demonstrations going here. One by Bob Fosbury on infrared and some of its interesting modern sort of implications, but linking back to William's discovery. And the other one by students from Cardiff University, led by the course director, who had made some rather amazing virtual 3D model of the 20-foot telescope, which I'll say a bit more later. It's on a computer, it's not a sort of a hologram type. And then after lunch, we have Josh Knoll talking about William Herschel and Georgian views on extraterrestrial life, which would be interesting because they had some pretty peculiar views from our point of view. And then after that, at 2:30, Michael Kerman will bring us to today by linking the amazing discoveries of Gaia with the kind of thing that William Caroline are doing. Then coffee, then a round table. So basically, all the speakers will be at this, obviously not very round table, but the idea is we have a sort of free for all and see what we haven't discussed so far. And then finally, our president, Alan Chapman, will give a sort of closing address in normal, inspirational, Old Testament speaker style, Alan Chapman style. And for those of you who are here, we'll then have drinks in the back room. So I'm afraid those of you who are listening remotely will have to find your own drinks, but that's okay. So I'm going to say a little more, but one other person we had hoped to involve was Michael Hoskin. Indeed, when we started planning this 18 months ago, Mike Edmunds, who has been a great helper in all of this, said, no, let's try and sort of contact Michael. And sadly, as we're trying to do that, he died. But we did also have a thought that there's a rather wonderful quote from Michael in the splendid film that George Sibley made. And via a variety of contacts through Jim Bennett and Michael, we have a clip of that film, which I will now show you.
When I wrote my first book on Herschel in 1963, I was greatly attracted by this man who pioneered what he called the construction of the heavens, rather than limiting himself to our little corner of the universe. And this led to one book on the Herschels, and then another book on the Herschels, until finally I found I'd written no fewer than 8 books on the Herschels. William made important contributions to the solar system, obviously. Uranus, the moons of Uranus, 2 new moons of Saturn, and much else besides. Half his papers are on the solar system. But the thrust of his intellectual interest was in the construction of the heaven. Some astronomers were great because they built wonderful telescopes, wonderful instruments for observations. Some astronomers were great because they carried out heroic programs of observations. Some astronomers were great because they theorized in exciting ways about this new evidence. William Herschel, I believe, is the only astronomer in history who excelled in all 3 categories.
Thank you. George. So George Sibley is the person we have to thank. Clear. And for making the whole film. We showed the film here a week ago, and it's quite well received. If you haven't seen it yourselves, go on to Amazon, where you can see it for a modest amount of money, to which an even more modest proportion goes to George. But it's a really great film, so I recommend it. Okay, so now to our first main speaker, Mike Edmunds, who's going to sort of give the introductory background piece. Mike Edmunds is Emeritus Professor of Astronomy at Cardiff University and former head of the School of Physics and Astronomy. He studied at Cambridge and has lived and worked in Wales for about 100 years now.
Thank you for reading these words.
But he's a Vice-President of Astrophysics, a very active one too, and also currently President of the RAS. So, Mike, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right. Even faster now. Okay. Really just to set just to give you a quick review of William's life, or my view of William's life, and to sort of set in a bit of historical context, hopefully just in quarter of an hour. I'll try my best. I'm going to do it mainly by timelines. They'll look all much the same, the timeline, so hopefully orient you. You see the timeline, the blue line across the curve with divisions on, going from about 1730 to 1840. As is mentioned, William died in 1822, so I do need a little bit of time just after his death to talk about a couple of things that came after his death. I'm going, as he born 1738 in Hanover, down here. As you've heard, as many of you will know, he went into the army. He's a musician. Came to England with the regiment, then went back to Germany, then came back to England, basically to avoid being drafted, or he was essentially a deserter to some extent, although that was all found out later on, and made his way as a musician in England. But to begin with, he started in London. Shortly after that, about 3 years after that, he moved to the north of England and had various jobs in the north of England. That's what I was talking to here. He had various jobs in the north of England, and then was offered in 1766 the organ position at the Octagon Chapel in Bath, and stayed in Bath then until 1782. That was really, during that time in Bath, is where he, I suppose, really developed his astronomy. We'll talk about that. And as you know, 1781, a date that everybody knows, I trust, is when he discovered Uranus, and that was the foundation of his fame. The king then offered him a pension, basically, and he no longer had to earn his living by music, and he moved to Windsor and Slough to be near the royals, and spent the next 40-odd years in Windsor and Slough, building various telescopes, doing observations and so on, until dying as a very famous man in 1822. Caroline, his sister, joined him from Germany in 1772. and she became she developed as a singer for a while. She really was his sort of housekeeper and dog's body for a lot of her life. Made a very great and perhaps increasingly acknowledged contribution to his actual scientific life. She was such a valuable assistant to him in, as well as being a bit of an astronomer in her own right. She discovered, I think, 7 comets, 8. Any advance on 8? Sold at 8 comets during her life. But she organised his work. She wrote it up. She did all sorts of stuff, but really organised this brilliant, but perhaps somewhat disorganised astronomical man. Okay. He married in 1788 once he got to Windsor, he met a rich widow, and that was quite an astute move because it sort of assured his financial future. He had a pension, but it wasn't a particularly large one. But he secured his financial future. Though, as you'll notice, marrying quite late in life. They had one son, John Herschel, born in 1792, who went on to be one of the great scientists of the 19th century, very well-known scientist in his own right, who carried on a lot of William's work into the Southern Hemisphere. He was knighted in 1860 and became president of the Royal Astronomical Society, the first president, in 1820, although he was pretty old and feeble by that time and really didn't take an awful lot of interest in the society. He was interested in the society, but didn't actually do a great deal of work for it before dying. Okay, so what was history like at the time? This will test your history. George II, when he was born, okay. George III for a lot of his life. George IV just at the end, okay. What happened then? Was it a quiet period in history? No, not really. The 18th century was an interesting one. The War of Jenkins' Ear was on. I only put that on. Do you remember learning about school about the War of Jenkins' Ear? I remember the title. I have no idea who it was between or what the outcome was, but I remember it. More interesting, perhaps, was the 7 Years' War, which was a war that ravaged Europe between sort of around the 1760s. Now, 1760s, remember, that's 1766 is when Herschel's coming to Bath. So that's going on in Europe around this time. 1776, you will remember, American Declaration of Independence. Okay, that's going on while William is in Bath. And last night, in fact, we had a song written by him as a sort of patriotic song, sung in a place where they were, where to help rally against the American independence. French Revolution, just a minor thing that happened in the 18th century, was going on during the time Herschel was now in royal court, circulating royal court circles in Windsor. As his life went on, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. Okay, so French, British history advancing there. And just after the end of his life, he went in 1822. 1825 was the first public steam railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the start of the railway age. So, once you're doing that, you're well into the Industrial Revolution. And at the beginning of this, in his early days, the Industrial Revolution hasn't really got going. It's during Herschel's life that the Industrial Revolution basically occurs, as well as the French Revolution. Okay, what about music? Well, this is my potted history, as it were, of Herschel's music. There's him on the top between up to 1822. Who was around at that time? Well, Haydn was sort of almost contemporary, which is interesting. Handel had died when Herschel was a small boy, but must have been a real inspiration. Again, a German composer, and Herschel performed a lot of Handel's music, particularly his oratorios, way of making money and so on. Performed in Bath, performed in Bristol. The composers of which I suspect had perhaps the most influence on him, though unfortunately I don't our musical director from last night isn't here, so I can probably get away with saying this. Well, probably the Bachs. I think not the old one, but the CPE Bach and JC Bach, those who know those composers at all. They were a bit more adventurous than Bach, and I suspect they were a bit of an influence on him. Mozart, of course, is there, but you notice I put a sort of dashed line through this. Charles was talking about Herschel's two halves of his life. Up to that dashed line, he's a musician. He's earning his money by an awful lot by teaching instruments, really, as well as writing music, choirs, concerts, all that sort of thing. Once he gets to that line, he gets his pension, and he's able to devote himself, basically, so far as I can see, virtually full-time to music. I think he did as far as I know, he did very little music after he got his pension. So Mozart was around, but whether he ever heard much of Mozart, I very much doubt. And as you can see, he probably he wasn't, in his musical life, would not have been influenced by Beethoven at all, because Beethoven was a small boy when Herschel gave up being a musician. So he's very much influenced, where his influence in his musical life comes from the earlier era, not from the later era of his life. And those of you who listened to his music last night, I think would have caught that it's sort of nearer to the Baroque than to the Romantic. Okay. So here's William in Bath. This is just a timeline of his time in Bath. Alexander joined him. He came, if you remember, 1766. His brother Alexander joined before Caroline came, and Alexander was quite a key figure in many ways in helping him with his manufacture of various things right through his life. He was the sort of odd job man who helped him build things. The start of his recorded observations were around 1774, and he sort of got into the intelligentsia in Bath, if like this way, apart from his musical life. But when he joined the Bath Philosophical Society around 1780, 1781, Uranus is discovered. 1782, he's off to Windsor. And these are the various places he lived at in Bath. And those of you who are joining me on the walk tomorrow morning, we'll visit a lot of these places as we go around Bath. If anybody has heard about the walk but hasn't had a chance to join, there are a few places left. If you want to see me during the day, we can sign you up for the walk tomorrow. About an hour and a half from 11 tomorrow morning, if anyone's interested. Okay. Now, he was self-taught to a great extent. And here are a couple of the books that he used to carry around with him. He started off, I think, looking at harmonics, musical theory. And the guy who wrote a treatise on that, Smith, also wrote a book on optics. And I suspect what happens, he bought the optics having read the harmonics. And then the rest is, as they say, history. He got fascinated by the optics, making telescopes, and into astronomy, but very much self-taught. Now, what was the story of astronomy when William started? Well, the story of astronomy in the 18th century is really the story of positional astronomy. That's what it was really about. Where are exactly the position of the stars, because we need to know them accurately, just so we know where to look, apart from anything else, but also because of the needs of navigation and the possibility of finding longitude by the stars and so on. It was very much a commercially and naval-driven thing, is to be able to navigate, and for that you needed accurate stellar positions. And very much a lot of the work of what would be called so-called professional astronomers, not that there were many of them, was on positional astronomy. And talking about this, I'm greatly indebted to our chairman, Alan Chapman's wonderful book, Dividing the Circle, if you want to know about these times. It's a brilliant exposition of the history of positional astronomy in the 18th century. Now, the sort of thing that developed by about 1750 to quite accurate stuff. This is the Byrd-Bradley quadrant. A device like this would be beginning to get stellar positions to the order of 1 or 2 seconds of arc. Something like that, which was good enough, getting good enough for good navigation. And we'll hear this afternoon about more modern and rather more accurate positions in astronomy. In fact, how extraordinarily the subject has advanced. Now, Newton died in 1727. There'd been transits of Venus in 1761, 1769. And things like positional astronomy, as well as being important for navigation, they were trying to detect the parallax, the motion of stars caused by the Earth going around the sun yearly. Because if you could observe the parallax of a star as the Earth moves around the sun, you could demonstrate that the Earth was moving and, the Copernican system worked and so on. Nobody could do that. Nobody could get accurate enough positions in order to show that, in fact, the stars some of the nearest stars did move a little bit because of the motion of the Earth around the sun. By 1717, nobody had done it, and they're not going to do it in Herschel's lifetime. But people were trying to get more and more accurate observations of positions. Herschel ploughs his own furrow, though. He gets interested in all sorts of stuff, as was mentioned by Hoskin. He's interested in observation, data, theory, whatever. And his big breakthrough is discovering Uranus in 1781. This is the notebook in which he noted it down. Then he moves. He's already making bigger telescopes in Bath. He moves to Slough and produces various telescopes of various kinds, starts selling them and so on. I'm not going to go into that. That'll be part of, I'm sure Jim will say something about that. What his fame rests on, though, is things like his catalogue of nebulae. He took notice of the nebulae and star clusters he could see in the sky. The Frenchman Messier had started observing these things before Herschel, but he'd made a catalogue, or Messier's list, because these things were a bloody nuisance when you're trying to discover comets. And there's a smudge, and it isn't a comet, it's something nebular or other. Oh, God, let's go. So he has a list of those, so you can ignore them. Herschel was a little more subtle and said, might be interesting. Okay, and he begins to catalogue nebulae and clusters of stars and various things. That's one of his really great contributions to astronomy. He also, as it was said, the construction of the heavens, he did star counts around the sky, and by looking at the number of stars in different directions, was able to suggest that we live in a galaxy, or what he called it, he thought for a while was the whole universe. He hadn't recognized nebulae as external galactic systems at that time. So by just counting how many stars you see in each direction, you can make some idea about what sort of star system we live in. And that when he was trying to construct the heavens. That was by 1785. He also works on cataloguing of double stars. I won't say much about that. Catalogues of double stars are extremely useful and became very important in demonstrating the existence of gravity outside the solar system. So here's his, if you like, we're almost done. This is the sort of scientific timeline. Death of Newton. Things on the bottom are outside Herschel stuff, Venus transit Messier. Here's the stuff above that he did, but in Windsor and Slough. Uranus, constructing the universe, the nebula catalogues, the double star catalogues. Meanwhile, this is going on among the professionals. They're trying to do the positional stuff, and that's their main thrust. Herschel is working in his own way as to make much more broad in his approach and more Catholic in his taste of what he thinks is interesting. Parallax was finally discovered after Herschel's death. It was in 1883 that parallax was finally discovered. 1838, sorry, parallax was finally discovered by Bessel. And by that time, telescopes were moving away from the wonderful reflecting instruments that we'll hear about that Herschel used into refractors as a result of the development of good achromatic doublets and triplets as lenses. And this is the famous Fraunhofer diffractor, which was probably state of the art in 1824. That's it. Okay, I think it's my pleasure now. If we can we get a screen save? What do I have to do? Does anybody know? To get Jim Bennett up.
Right. You need to stop screen share on.
There he is, Jim. Hi, Jim. Okay. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Bennett. You've got in your spiel about his life. He's basically been a great museum curator particularly Science Museum in London, also Oxford and Cambridge, I think. And he got interested in Herschel when he worked on the RAS archives on Herschel early in his career. And I look forward very much to hearing you talk, Jim. I've just got to make sure we get you up on the thing. You've got to unmute. That's it. You should be unmuted now. Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
We can. Now, can I get you? Can I get this full screen?
I can do that, can't I?
Try it. Try and share and whatever.
Well, I won't share just yet, but I'll share in a few minutes once I've started. You can see me for a moment before I share and disappear into a little bubble.
There we are.
Can you hear me well enough? I thought I'd use this this thing because it's clearer than the. Okay, I can change if it is.
The acoustics are excellent, Jim.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Mike. I'll share in a moment. I'm talking to you not from very far away, as it happens. So it's very kind of you to allow me to do this remotely. It's a health issue. I'm not in a state to come today, but I can certainly I hope talk to you from. It's only from Oxford, so I'm actually not very remote at all. But it's very kind of the organisers to suggest that I would do this paper remotely when I said there was an issue. And since my paper is coming near the beginning of our program, and since it's my task to deal in particular with the telescopes, I thought I'd begin with a sort of sweeping overview of the instruments he used himself in order of their introduction in his career. I'm billed as talking about the telescopes. In fact, what I will do is just do that overview very quickly, which I hope will be helpful for framing not just my paper, but what's going to happen throughout the day. But I will, instead of talking about the telescopes generally, which I feel for many of you is fairly well known, I would do something which isn't, I don't think, well known at all, because it's been neglected. And I'll talk about the polishing records at the Royal Astronomical Society and what we can learn from those. So that'll be a little more focused, but I hope it will be interesting in that it deals with a particular issue, a particular problem, a controversial issue in the 19th century, and my answer to that, which is can be mediated through the papers at the Royal Astronomical Society, to whom, and particularly to Sean, I'm very grateful for helping me with access to those. Of course, as Mike was saying, I got into all this by cataloguing it myself way back in the 1970s, 74 or something like that, another lifetime. And it's probably only a reminder, this framing is only a reminder for most of you, but Herschel made a good many telescopes for paying customers, but we will consider only the ones he used himself. And there are two classes of these instruments, so let's see about sharing this screen of mine. Sure. Okay, has that worked for you all? Yeah. You see the famous drawing by William Watson of William Herschel's 7-foot telescope. This design, well, the two classes of telescope, I suppose, was what I wanted to say, was that some were small. We can classify them by size. Some are very small and fairly static in their design, while others are larger and underwent many changes throughout his career. So the small reflectors are the 7-foot and the 10-foot. This was really a great sort of workhorse for Herschel throughout his life, as I'm sure you know, 6.2, 6.3 inches aperture, Newtonian. He reached this design in 1776. The drawing by his friend, Mike mentioned the Bath Philosophical Society, leading light, or not so much of a leading light at that time, but later was William Watson, whom he met by chance, Herschel's observing in his garden. Watson comes by after some dinner or other, I think, and sees this interesting episode going on, and approaches him, and they become firm friends. And Watson's a great ally at the Royal Society and so on. Anyway, this is his lovely drawing, a little ink wash drawing at the original at the Royal Astronomical Society, which he made in 1783. And that's the reason for that was that Herschel was preparing. This is an echo or a pre-echo, I suppose, of things to come. He was preparing what he called a full description of all my apparatus. There's great puzzlement about this when Herschel, of course, discovered Uranus, as Mike said in 81. Who was this guy? Who was this musician, this clarinet player? You know, we don't know about. He's done something that's never happened in the history of astronomy, and you know, it was a real puzzle. So one of the ways that puzzle could possibly be mediated was an explanation of the telescopes and why these telescopes could reveal things that other people had seen. I mean, Flamsteed had seen Uranus, but he thought it was a star, of course, because with his small aperture telescopes, it didn't reveal itself as having a sensible diameter, but you had to have a telescope like Herschel's with a larger aperture, an amateur telescope, really, but with a much larger aperture than Flamsteed had in order to resolve that disk. Well, it wasn't really a disk, but that smudge, as Mike said, which he thought, as you know, was a comet in the first instance. So that was with this telescope, this Newtonian. You can see there's it's quite manipulable. There's a slow vertical motion worked by that set of pulleys on the right-hand side at the back of towards the back of the tube, and towards the middle there's a slow horizontal motion. There's nothing equatorial about any of Herschel's telescopes. They're roughly alt-azimuth, all of them, all the way through. And they all have sort of suspensions in some sense or other in this alt-azimuth matrix. Okay, so then there's the 10-foot is much the same, just a little more struts and a bit more length and so on. Herschel sold quite a lot of these 10-foots as well as 10 feet, I suppose, as well as the 7-foot. They were the ones that were really sold. Though he would sell you anything. I mean, we're moving forward a bit into the large 20-foot and the 40-foot. You could, on his price list as a maker, he would. There was the 40-foot was there with a price. No one ever, wisely, of course, and thankfully for Herschel, no one ever actually ordered one. But they were there and they were supposed to be available. So those are the two that said much the same throughout his life. But the next in the sequence is what's called the small 20-foot to distinguish it from the later larger one. The aperture of the 10-foot, by the way, is 9 inches. The aperture here is 12 inches. And this, again, is one of these drawings by William Watson. And now he's getting something larger. He needs a larger aperture. He wants to see further. He wants to see with a better resolution. That requires, from his grinding and polishing methods, a longer focal length. And the trouble then is that Newtonian focal point is up at in the air, so he needs to have this freestanding ladder in order to get up there. There's still he's strung it up from a pole in the way he was presumably doing with his earlier refractors that he began with, but he still has managed a slow vertical and a slow horizontal motion, which happens at the base of the tube, but operated from the observer's position up that ladder. Now you can imagine this is a nightmare. I mean, you know, he's up this ladder in the cold and probably windy, and he has to hold his pen and his bottle of ink and his piece of paper that he's making, a notebook that he's noting. He hasn't any help at this stage. Carolyn's not involved at this stage. I mean, the whole thing is, pretty well impossible, except that he manages it for quite a while until he eventually decides that this is, a bit of a dead loss and he'd better see whether he can't make a more sensible stand. The aperture here, as I said, is 12 inches. And the sequence of large instruments really begins with this so-called small 20 foot. Not a very satisfactory arrangement for the observer. But we know he wanted to move to a much larger telescope because he tries to make a 30-foot telescope, which I think had a 3-foot aperture. But that doesn't work. The casting is dangerously disastrous, and it's a much more elaborate stand, but nothing like one of the later ones. But nonetheless, you can see that shows his ambition. So when the next telescope did actually come along, the so-called large 20-foot, the aperture is relatively modestly larger. So it's 18.7 inches. And this was introduced in 1783. And this print was published by Herschel in 1794. So there's quite a long gap there. And the key to the success of this instrument was in that gap, Herschel was developing it as he used it. So he was bringing in innovations, he was trying them out, he was accepting the ones that worked, and he was moving on from the ones that were less successful. So the main developments are in the mounting and the management here, and it's developed in situ with a telescope in regular use. I mean, you know, the most famous one is probably that he moves from a Newtonian to a front view construction. But there are lots of other more boring things. He's adapted for what he calls sweeping, where he sweeps in the meridian up and down in the meridian with a change of altitude of 2 degrees. And he has a zone clock, as he calls it, to ring a bell at the top and bottom of the sweep. So the workman, whom he has now introduced, and of course he also introduces Carolyn with the use of this, who will note down the observations from an indoor room in the house upstairs. He adapts, there's all sorts of adaptations for sweeping the zone clock. There's a thing called the polar distance machine, which you really need to be really into this to want to know anything about the polar distance machine, but it's up there. I don't know if this is visible to you. That's the polar distance machine, which he spends a lot of time making that work. And eventually it takes a line from the tube with changes in elevation and carries that line to a polar distance clock, a register which Carolyn has alongside for what they call, or for polar distance. You might think of it well, for polar distance. And the other register for right ascension is a Shelton regulator, which Carolyn has both of these in front of her. Now, this is the most successful of Herschel's telescopes, as I'm sure you all know. Maybe he should have stopped here, but it is a wonderful instrument, all that sweeping for nebulae and so on. The double star work was mostly done, as I remember, with the smaller telescopes, but this was his most successful and most used instrument. He did go on, typical of Herschel, he's never satisfied, you know, he wants more and better always, and more doesn't always mean better. So what he does is he doubles everything. He even more than doubles the aperture. This is a 4-foot, this is the famous 40-foot telescope, of course, and it's a print published by Herschel in 1794. I know you'll think when you see this, it's the print from the Phil Trans. It isn't quite. There are some changes. But, actually, no, this is, when I look at some of the detail, this is the Phil Trans print. But it was originally published, something very similar by Herschel himself in 94 as an independent, initiative of publicity. It wasn't a success, really. Mike mentioned the satellites of Saturn. Yes, it did do a few things, but really it was a bit of a white elephant and wasn't really ever used much for sweeping at all, and just became an object of admiration and astonishment and attracted visitors and got in the way of Herschel doing his astronomy. But nonetheless, I mean, publicity presumably, as we would think today is very important. And this is what Herschel is associated with, became the emblem until recently of the Royal Astronomical Society and so on. But not really. There were lots of problems. One was management. This thing was unwieldy in that you couldn't respond to the night sky at all quickly, and it would have changed by the time you were pointing where you wanted to look. And the other problem was that one problem was that the big mirror was very heavy, and Herschel he tried lots of ways of polishing it by hand with manual help and so on, but it didn't work. And he ended up, but it worked in the sense that he ended up with polishing machines. So he moves to machines using polishing machines with this telescope, and then he introduces machines for the others. So in that sense, there was a positive outcome. It tarnished quickly, though. I mean, he had to introduce more copper into one of the mirrors, certainly, to try to maintain the figure of the telescope as he changed in altitude, and it wasn't that wasn't good for maintaining the polish. Had to be polished more often, and the large mass of metal attracted condensation more readily, and so on. So altogether, this was not a success, and he really used the large 20-foot. But also, he built this telescope. Now, this is the largest telescope he built for a client. The client was the King of Spain, and this is a 25-foot telescope for the King of Spain, and the aperture was 2 feet. And this was a successful telescope. Herschel used this quite a bit. He built it he completed it in 1797, and eventually used it until 1802, when it was shipped off to Madrid with the most wonderful sets, 2 sets, one Herschel provided and one that was prepared in Madrid, of a detailed account of the management, and so detailed that even though this was destroyed in the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish have been able to build what looks like a wonderful replica. I haven't seen it in the flesh, but that was made possible because we have a very detailed record of this telescope and in manuscript, and someone might publish it one day, perhaps. This was essentially the same in its workings, just scaled up a bit for the large 20-foot. So it's a great resource for the large 20-foot as well as itself. The only other telescopes which fall into this sequence are, first of all, this 10-foot, the large 10-foot, as it's called. You remember the small 10-foot we began with. The large 10-foot was built, in a sense, for Herschel's old age, is usually thought. It was completed in 1799. It has a 2-foot aperture, so his only foray into trying to combine a much larger aperture with a shorter focal length. The whole idea being to be able to manage this thing quickly and easily and responsively to the sky. And he used it a fair bit. I mean, it didn't become his favorite instrument or anything like that, but it was used. It was used sufficiently, I think, to call it a success. And then finally, I do want to include the rebuilt large 20-foot, which I'm sure you all know is famous illustration from the Cape observations of John Herschel, because it was rebuilt with John in mind. The structure really had to be substantially rebuilt. The mirrors had to be repolished. John had to go out fully equipped to do this all by himself, both the polishing and the management and recording, because Carolyn wouldn't be there. And the last repolishing was done by John and William working together so that William could tutor his son in his methods and provide him with a familiarity with the polishing machine he would take with him. And that's the end of my brief overview. I've taken rather longer than I intended to, but I think the point is that this is all pretty familiar, I imagine, for many of you. And I thought that in the substance of the paper, I would take a particular issue, because what we've been looking at here are the stands and the management. And we haven't been thinking about in many ways, the more crucial elements in telescope building, which was the casting, the composition, the grinding, the polishing of the mirrors. And Herschel was criticized by some in the subsequent generation of telescope builders. I'm moving to a more reading style here because there's substance to make sure you get across. I get across. Specifically, he was criticized by the next generation of builders on reflecting telescopes that he had left them a great deal of detail on the construction of his stands, in particular the account of the 40-foot in the Philosophical Transactions, but nothing at all on the crucial matters of the composition, grinding, and polishing of his mirrors. Probably the most outspoken of these critics was Thomas Romney Robinson, a man outspoken on many things, at Armagh Observatory, who was very involved with the telescope building of Lord Rosse at Birr Castle. Now, he wrote that because, quote, Herschel published nothing of the means to which his success was owing, the construction of a large reflector is still, as much as ever, a perilous adventure in which each individual must grope his way. That's pretty stark. And Robinson likened this, perhaps even more tellingly, he likened this to the well-known secrecy on such matters adopted by the commercial maker James Short. That was a bit of a blow, because Short was a commercial maker. What was Herschel? He was somewhere in between. Now, the main part of my paper will aim to show that this charge was not justified. So the question is, was this charge against Herschel justified? I aim to show, no, it wasn't. And to do that through the record Herschel left in his manuscript archives preserved at the Royal Astronomical Society. So this, I hope, will be the less familiar part of my paper. Now, if this were a sermon, it occurred to me, if this were a sermon, my text would be taken from the second book of Newton, generally known as Optics, and it would read as follows: this is Newton, this art of polishing would be better taken, will be better learnt by repeated practice than by my description. So keep that in mind. That's Newton's advice. It'd be better to do it than to read about it. But even so, Newton's example was very influential because he did his own polishing and tried to describe his attempts. By working his own mirrors and committing himself to this manual work, Newton set a precedent that was influential for later mathematicians and natural philosophers occupied with optics. The majority of these men were gentlemen practitioners outside the trade, unlike Short. Well, Short straddled it in some ways, this divide, but they were outside the trade of telescope making and had no involvement with the customary communication of mechanical skill through apprenticeship. They had to resort to their familiar resource of words. Now, we haven't time to deal with the prescription and methods published between Herschel, between Newton and Herschel, before Herschel became involved. But they begin with Samuel Molyneux and James Bradley, and separately John Hadley, all published in Smith's Complete System of Optics, which you've already seen, of 1738. It was from Smith's book that, as we know, Herschel first learnt about making reflecting telescopes. Then there were published accounts from the physician John Mudge and the clergyman John Edwards. Mudge's account was particularly regarded. His paper in the Philtrans was recognized with the Royal Society's highest award, the Copley Medal, which also on its own shows how important this topic was considered. While doing his best to capture all the detail of the operation, Mudge also recognized Newton's doubts when he says, quote, "I will describe in the best manner I can, though many little circumstances which will be unavoidably omitted, and which at the same time are frequently essential to the success of a mechanic process, can only be supplied by actual experience." So reference my text from the second book of Newton. Throughout the whole account, Mudge is detailed and loquacious, yet he doubts whether his literary technology is adequate for the purpose. Quoting him again, "For though I have endeavoured to be particular as I can, I am afraid almost too much so, yet it is scarcely possible to supply a want of dexterity arising from habit only by the most laboured and minute description." Now listen to this. "And though the above account may appear irksome to the reader, as it lies cold before the eye, I am very sure that whoever attempts to make this instrument will not complain of it as tediously particular." Isn't that a wonderful piece of prose? I mean, you know, it's just fantastic. In the Filtrans, maybe the scientists present can see whether they can risk introducing something like "may appear irksome to the reader as it lies cold before the eye." I mean, you know, I think scientific papers were just wonderful. It reminds me of Yeats, you know, "cast a cold eye on life," much later. Sorry about that. Well, it is the Bath Literary and Philosophical Society and the Scientific Society, so perhaps I can get away with that for once. Anyway, Edwards was published in the Nautical Almanac in 1783, so you get the idea. And he adds his weight to the now familiar caution. And Edwards says a little experience in these matters will better suffice than a volume written on the subject. So these are the guys who are doing their best to communicate this. And in Mudge's case, he even thinks he might have gone too far, and yet they don't think it's a very successful project at all. So what about our William? How is he going to deal with the problem? He begins by keeping a careful record of all his polishing activity. Herschel's detailed, thorough, and systematic documentation of his grinding and polishing activity is preserved in the original volumes at the Royal Astronomical Society. This is an opening from Volume 1 of the fair copy made by Carlin of William's polishing record. Herschel's work of grinding and polishing began in November 1773. He grinds using a brass tool with star cuts and fine emery. You realize that the speculum is moving on top. He's moving the speculum on top of the polisher. And then he polishes on pitch, either warmed with water to soften it or trying various fluids for the same purpose, while adding putty to the pitch surface. It is possible to use the subsequent record, Herschel's subsequent record, extending over many years to follow what seems to be every step of this practice. He begins with only straight strokes, as you see here, in fact, in the manner of Molyneux and Bradley, and in particular of Hadley, only occasionally adding a round movement. On the 26th of April, 1778, Herschel records that, quote, having lately met, now that's a new thing, with Mr. Mudge's description for polishing, so he's read the paper in the Filtrans, must be a real revelation to him. He prepares everything needed to test the recommendations that were attracting so much attention and winning the Copley Medal. He makes more use of round strokes and begins to aim for a parabola. Herschel is far from subservient to Mudge's prescriptions, testing everything by its practical outcome and combining and alternating strokes in patterns he devises himself. The main influence of Mudge seems to have been as an encouragement for Herschel to characterize distinctive strokes, as he calls them, at first only straight and round, and to experiment with routines for deploying them. He introduces new parameters in addition to the direction and shape of the stroke by beginning to mention length and speed. New patterns of movement emerge, together with distinctive nomenclature. The nodulated stroke has a zigzag movement, as you see here. The glory stroke directs the mirror, quote, over the center of the polisher, always to different parts of the compass. Or an eccentric stroke avoids the center of the polisher. It begins to refer back to experiments in the numbered sequence. Quote, I tried once more the method of avoiding the center of the polisher, which was used in the 18th experiment. It may be called an eccentric stroke, unquote. The terminology develops further qualifications. The eccentric strokes, for example, can be described as moderate or great. This first series of experiments ends with Herschel concluding that Mudge's methods will not work and will not yield the parabolic profile he wants. He recorded his rejection of Mudge some 3 years, you have to remember this, quite remarkable, before his discovery of Uranus, his recognition by the Royal Society, and his own award of the Copley Medal. This isolated and unknown telescope maker was prepared on the basis of his own extensive experimentation to dismiss the conclusions of the current medalist. Quite a remarkable thing for a young man. Or perhaps not so young. On the 14th of May, 1778, Herschel began a fresh program of work, no longer relying on the existing written advice, but pursuing his own imaginative combinations of strokes. And learning from the growing record of his results, he announced this to his journal, quote, the trial and failure of the method of figuring mirrors pointed out by Mr. Mudge is a great inducement for making experiments to establish a more successful one. And having already polished several excellent mirrors, though more by chance than by rule, it will not perhaps be very difficult, well, that's what he says, it will not be very difficult to reduce the art of making specula to a regular theory, well supported by the facts. The record becomes even more detailed and complex than before, increasingly referring back and building up an archive of mechanical experience. The vocabulary is further enriched. Circular strokes are not the same as round ones. New strokes are introduced. The divided stroke, the equally divided stroke, the changeable eccentric stroke, the divided reducing stroke, the hourglass stroke, and so on, while the modulations are captured with terms such as waves and vibrations. Strokes are often identified by the record in an earlier experiment, a notable example being dated the 14th of November, 1778, quote, I repolished a 7-foot mirror number 2, which bore only an aperture of 3.5 inches, the outside rays being of too long a focus. I used the divided reducing stroke of the 170th experiment, and in a very short time made it a most capital speculum. The Georgian planet was afterwards discovered with it. So that's something. That's Uranus, of course. We have in this extraordinary record, what we have here is a documentary account of Herschel's struggle to capture his manual skills in words, first as an archive for his own use, and then as a tool for communicating with others. As a former musician and music teacher, he was familiar with the general problem of systematizing and encoding skilled dexterity and communicating this to others. The vocabulary he developed of strokes of increasing refinement and complexity had its equivalents in teaching musical instruments. From January 1789, Herschel began to introduce polishing machines, at first for his 40-foot telescope, and from then on, much of the record concerns the development and use of these machines, but was no less detailed and meticulous for that. Herschel's appreciation of the challenges of bringing all this together into a manageable resource emerges through the record itself, as do the steps he took in response. On the 27th, I'll rush along here, the 27th of October 1798, he records a significant change of attitude, where he begins to imagine his polishing record being consulted not only by himself, but by another person. That's quite new. He says, all the experiments in these 3 volumes, being now brought under proper articles to an alphabetical index, I will proceed to write down such things that have not been explained, because they were perfectly known to me, but may not be familiar to another person who would undertake to make specula. The indexing work referred to here is also preserved in the manuscript archive, indicating, for example, the successful experiments for each individual mirror. Records of 2 attempts to create a coherent treatise from this archive of mechanical documentation are preserved among Herschel's manuscripts. One entitled, quote, Results of Experiments in the Construction of Specula, unquote, arranges the information extracted from the experimental record we've been looking at according to a subject classification comprising 59 sections of up to 9 articles. This is part of the subject classification for... Can you hear me all right? I'm being told about low audio quality. Are you okay with it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, that must be a mistake from my system. Part of the subject classification used for Herschel's first attempt to draw the results of his polishing experiments into a treatise. And the outcome of this is 129 pages in Carlin's hand, and although systematic, is not very coherent. A second attempt, later marked by John Herschel as the second redaction, entitled Results of Experiments on the Construction of Mirrors, is governed by a different, think of the work involved here, a different subject classification comprising 33 sections and made up of 29 articles. A remarkable effort to draw together Herschel's results into a coherent treatise began with the transfer, this is remarkable, the transfer of the extensive notes of his practical work onto small pieces of paper, each one containing what might be called a datum of information. I'll show you some of these. There are thousands of them. Short pieces of paper where they copied everything out and classified it according to the new classification and cut them all up, then arranged them according to the classification, and then Carlin had to copy them all out. Again, I'm nearly finished, Mike, if you're thinking of...
5 minutes, well,
yeah,
4 would be better.
Nearly finished. So these are some of these are all arranged to this in accordance with this second subject classification. So to judge by the handwriting on these thousands of slips of paper, both William and Carlin were involved in this process. The slips are marked up with their allocated places in the new subject classification, then arranged in order, and the whole copied out onto 179 folios by Carlin. The opening page of the second redaction is in front of you now of Herschel's results. The result is more coherent than the previous redaction, and many aspects do amount to useful and practical guidance. Elsewhere, however, the series of extracts seems disconnected. So further work would be needed to draw the whole into a fully coherent treatise for mirror makers. That such a treatise was intended is indicated, this is the final capstone on my case, was intended is indicated by the survival of a series of 59 machine drawings to illustrate the second redaction, made by John Herschel under his father's direction. John has noted at the front, quote, all drawn at Slough by JFWH under WH's inspection. This is a polishing machine, drawing by John Herschel to illustrate the second redaction. And this is a hoist, similarly. No publication resulted from this enormous effort over many years. I have yet to find clear evidence of why the project was abandoned, but for now, it might be imagined that in addition to the perennial problem of communicating manual skill in words, the sheer size and variety of the accumulated record Herschel has been obliged to create made it difficult to draw together into a coherent and publishable account. The fact that the Herschels had given so large an investment of time, which is largely forgotten now, a large investment of time and effort to their attempts to capture and codify William's knowledge and skill, but eventually failed to publish, reinforces again the difficulty of such an enterprise. Because most developments in the reflecting telescope in the 18th century occurred outside the instrument-making trade and its apprenticeship culture, communication beyond the household depended on prose with all its inadequacies, evident to practitioners from Newton onwards. So, Thomas Romney Robinson was being unfair, though he could not have known. In fact, the Herschels had made an enormous and sustained effort towards codification and publication. Yet the art of publishing telescope mirrors remained intractably manual and defied William's ambition, as he had put it, quote, to reduce the art of making specula to a regular theory. Thank you very much.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Jim. I had no idea about that material. Fantastic. We've got time for just a couple of quick questions before caffeine.
We have two on the panel.
Okay, can we start with Charles, then we'll go to the two on the channel.
Like Mike, it was a fantastic talk, and I didn't know either. Why do you suppose the story is not better known?
Well, yes, you can see there's an awful lot of it, and it's very, very, very detailed. I mean, what was Mudge's description? Something about being I can't find it now, but Mudge put it very well. Tediously particular. Is it tediously particular? Well, I mean, frankly, who else would look at it apart from me? I don't know, but I was classifying it after all, so you know I had to look at absolutely everything. Well, it's all there. I know. Why hasn't it been? Well, why has it not been attracted attention? Well, I'm not the person to answer that because I've attended to it, but so far as I can see, hardly anyone else has.
Can we have the questions from the channel, please?
Yes. Dick Collins asks, William made one or two small scopes for the Caroline to use for comet sweeping. Have we further knowledge of these?
Not in this context. They're not included. I suppose Herschel saw that as a separate operation, and by the time he was helping Caroline out with that, you know, he had moved on to the bigger ambitions, and the technology used for Caroline's mirrors must have been simply much the same as was now being used for the much larger ones. So there's probably nothing very new to say. So I'm afraid I haven't come across the sweepers, Caroline sweepers, being included in this record.
Okay, and one last question, please, from the web.
Say, he asks, is there a record of his telescope customers for the 7 and 10 foot telescopes?
Could I have that?
He asks whether there is actually a written record of the customers for the 7 and 10 foot telescopes.
Yes, I don't know the named customers, but there is an article about the commercial. It was a long time ago, maybe by Stevenson. I haven't read it for many years. This work is going, you know, something I became familiar with, as Mike said himself, a long time ago. But yes, someone has worked on that. And if you send me I'll look up my bibliography and help you to find that if you can just send me a wee message afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we've run out of time on this talk. Brilliant talk. Thank you very much.